Do you have a mashpia? Do you have a Rav? It's such an important thing to ensure that even when we wobble in our spirituality, we don't lose our way completely. The pasuk in this week's parasha that says, that if a person inadvertently chas v'shalom killed somebody else, if they run to the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, there they will remain alive. In other words, they're protected from the family who wants to take revenge. So Yalfin, we learn from that one of the rules about the person who has to go to the Ir Miklat is Shatalmid Shagola Megalin Rabbi Imoy, that if a student has to go to the Ir Miklat, we exile his primary teacher with him. Shenema, because the pasuk says V'chai, that if you go to that city, you're going to live. That doesn't just mean not die. Means we have to create for that person a life where he could actually live as he should, which most importantly includes spiritual input that he could live as a yid. So the Rambam in his book of halacha quotes this halacha and says, that if a student is exiled to one of the refuge cities, you have to send his rabbi along with him. So he says that exactly as we've just learned from the Gemara, that you've got to send his rabbi along with him because the Torah says he has to be able to live, and you don't live without a teacher. And then he adds something. He says that if people who are masters of wisdom or people who seek wisdom, their life without learning Torah, it's not a life. So we need to understand what's the Rambam adding by saying that extra phrase. So we're going to suggest that what the Rambam's adding here is that he's removing, or he is disclaiming an issue that might have been a simple question for us, which is, we know that you have to supply all of a person's amenities in the city where they're going to be, in the city of refuge. The Gemara says you have to put them in a place where there's drinking water, where there's a marketplace, that he could do a business, etc. Still, it doesn't make sense. Why do we supply him with everything that he needs at the expense of another person, and not just an ordinary person, his primary teacher? Chelek is Rabbi Golus, going to send his Rav into exile in order to teach him Torah. Doesn't seem to make sense. Especially when you consider who we're talking about over here. We're talking about the kind of student who unfortunately made a terrible error and he killed somebody. Yes, of course it was unintentional. But the fact that such a terrible incident should happen by his hand illustrates that he's not as he should be. That's why he has to go into Golus. Because exile is a form of atonement, and therefore by being exiled he'll experience atonement, and you only need atonement if something wasn't right. Had he been an appropriate student, the Abisha would never have allowed such a disaster to be at his hand. As the Gemara links the pasuk to the person who kills inadvertently, that bad things come from people who are Rishoim. So he's not the ideal student, necessarily. Why are we sending his Rav into Golus? Because of him. So therefore the Rambam adds that those people are the masters of wisdom, and the people who seek wisdom, their life without Torah is not a life at all, and therefore that means Talmud Torah for this student is not just like another important amenity like drinking water. So we'll say, here's somebody who learned Torah, and this has become almost his occupation. And therefore, you have to give him, in the same way as you've got to give him a way to earn a living, you have to give him a way to perpetuate his Torah learning. No, it's more than that. So this is a question of life and the opposite of life. He says, life without Torah is not life. Especially since the Torah says the reason he's going to the Ir Miklat is in order to live. And we have no choice. We have to send his Rav into Golus, because without that he won't be alive, and we have to provide him with life. The source is That a person who is a wise person without Torah is considered like as if they're not living. Is apparently a clear pasuk from Mishlei, that Chochmah gives life to those who master Chochmah. Okay, so that's what the Rambam's telling us. If this person doesn't have his teacher, he's not alive, and the Torah says we have to allow him to live. It's literally a matter of life and death. The only thing is that this really needs a lot of analysis. Surely where the Rambam wants to get, the conclusion he wants to arrive at is the principle of sending the Rav into Golus together with the students. Surely then only applies if he's that kind of a student who can't live without Torah. To the extent that, as the Rambam says, without Torah his life is not alive. But the halacha in the original Gemara, and even in the Rambam, about a student who gets sent to the Ir Miklat doesn't discriminate which kind of student. It's generic. A student has to go with his Rav. So the Gemara didn't make any distinction between the caliber of the student before deciding to send his Rav into Golus with him. To the contrary. Straight after, the Gemara tells us that when a student goes into Golus, his Rav goes with him. It continues. Actually, there's a practical lesson over there for teachers. Don't get involved with students who are a little bit on the edge. You don't want to have a situation where your student has bad behavior, which leads to negligence, which leads to loss of life. And he'll have to go into Golus, and you'll have to go with him. Because the Gemara says that's something which is really in the world of the wicked. Which means that the most common version of a student who's going into Golus for having killed somebody is a student who's not the best student. So how's the Rambam saying we're actually talking about a student who is so invested in his Torah learning without it is not alive? How does the Rambam extract from the Gemara that the Gemara was talking about even such a student who is susceptible to killing somebody else is still considered people who seek Chochmah and can't live without Torah? You'll say, Eino Hogman means in his conduct. His conduct is not as it should be. Which means he's behaving inappropriately. But perhaps, as far as his learning is concerned, which is our topic over here, maybe his learning is as it should be. We know that that's not true. We can see with our own eyes that when a student is not where they should be in conduct, they certainly will not be where they should be in terms of diligence in their learning. Or pshita, and it goes without saying, and for sure, a student who is at the edge, who is capable of negligence and recklessness that could cause loss of life, he is for sure not the kind of person that the rabbi should have to be sent with him. Because surely somebody who's living for Torah and therefore needs his rabbi, if you're living for Torah, it should influence your conduct and certainly ensure that you're not reckless and negligent, you don't hurt people. So let's try a different angle as to what the Rambam meant and why he added that piece about people who are wise people can't live without Torah. So the Rogatchover gives a perspective where he says, this is a completely spiritual reason, don't look for a practical application. Or maybe and then he adds a simple reason why the rabbi has to go with. As mentioned, the fact that this is somebody who brought about the death of another person tells me he is not the ideal student. And the rabbi should have been more discerning and should never have gotten involved with teaching such a person, because you're not supposed to teach a student who is ill-suited to learn. This rabbi did. He's now going to pay the price, and he's got to go with. But what the Rambam's writing, that is an abstract spiritual concept. Avol, the Rebbe does not accept this answer so easily. First of all, we got to understand, why did the Rogatchover say this, that it's a spiritual reason? And therefore, the Rogatchover is suggesting the only practical reason why the rabbi has to go with is because the rabbi is also not so okay, because he should never have been involved in such a student. Because he recognized that his student was not an appropriate student, and he went against halacha, and he taught him anyway. Now he's getting punished. And the Rebbe has various other questions about the Pirush of the Rogatchover that he's not going to get into now. The main thing we're going to focus on is this. The fact that the Rambam quoted this explanation that people who are Baalei Chochma or seek Chochma, they cannot live without Torah. Where did he put it? In Mishnah Torah, which is not a book of philosophy, it's a book of practical halacha. You have no choice but to accept that from the Rambam's perspective, whatever the reason is behind the concept that you have to exile the Rav because the Talmud can't live without Torah, even if it is a spiritual reason, as the Rogatchover said, it has to be something that fits into the parameters of halacha. And it certainly can't be something that contradicts the practical halacha, which is any student who is exiled, his Rav has to go with him, not only inappropriate students. So therefore, if we really want to understand what the Rambam is saying, let's pay attention to the fact that the Rambam described two kinds of people over here. Baalei Chochma, masters of Chochma, and those who seek Chochma, they cannot live without Torah. Now we said that we believed the Rambam based that on the pasuk that says Chochma gives life to those who master it. Only spoke about Baalei Chochma. Whereas the Rambam added another category, people who seek Chochma. What did he intend with that? Because the Rambam's not just adding another expression over here, it's another category of person. The understanding of masters of wisdom is when you master something, it's yours. That means they have an intimate relationship with the Torah. They are very personally engaged with the Torah. That the person is considered a master over the Torah that he's learned. The Nikras al Shmoy, as the Gemara tells us, the Torah is quoted in his name. Which the Gemara says you can only achieve with very deep investment in your learning. That's Baalei Chochma, a very advanced level of learning. Whereas when the Rambam speaks about those who seek wisdom, he's adding another category. That category is people who are dissatisfied with the amount of Torah that they have already not only learned but personally acquired. But he's always seeking more. He's always chasing an opportunity to add and deepen his learning. To elevate himself in terms of understanding Torah. Because at the end of the day, Torah is infinite. As the pasuk says, that it is bigger than the land and wider than the sea. As the Rambam himself defines, if a person serves the Eibishter out of love, he engages in Torah learning, and he follows the paths of wisdom, until he becomes completely enraptured in love of Hashem, and he's totally fixated on learning Torah constantly. In other words, the Rambam is bringing perspective over here. At which point can you say that Torah is, or learning Torah is, a person's entire life? Not just because the person has mastered concepts in Torah, but rather that the person is fixated on Torah and completely invested consistently in learning Torah. Which raises the question we asked before, what prompted the Rambam to say that there is this category not only of learned people, but people who pursue learning at all times when that was not referenced in the pasuk. Besides that, the Rambam's angle now only strengthens the question we asked earlier, which was, we said the Rambam's explanation doesn't seem to match with the practical halacha. Now, that's even more the case. It seems like what the Rambam is saying is, in order to have a situation where the Rav has to go with the Talmud into Golus, you know what kind of a Talmud it has to be? Not just a person who is a master of Torah, but a person who is obsessed with Torah. How does that square off with the Gemara, which seems to be saying the exact opposite? The Gemara leans completely in the other direction, that who goes to Golus? A Talmud who's not really the most ideal Talmud. So the Rambam saying is kind of the highest level of Talmud, and the Gemara is saying is kind of on the edge, not the most appropriate Talmud. Which one is it? Which therefore forces us to re-examine what the Rambam meant with the word mevaksheha. Not as we would read at face value, that the Rambam saying there are two prerequisites for a Talmud before his Rav has to go with him. Balei Chochmah, he has to be a master of wisdom, and mevaksheha, completely obsessed with growing that wisdom. No, that's not how you should read this. The vav over here should not be written as a conjunction, and it should be written as an alternative oi. We have to understand that the Rambam is saying that when does the Rav have to go with the Talmud into Golus? Either when the Talmud is a Baal Chochmah, or when the Talmud is a Mevakesh Chochmah. Claim in other words, the Rambam might reach next sugim. The Rambam is actually talking about two completely different kinds of people. Aleph, one kind of person has already mastered wisdom, and the other person isn't there yet, but at least it's an aspiration for them. They are not yet masters of wisdom, but they'd love to be. Because the Torah promises us that if we invest effort, we will see success. Then if a person has an honest aspiration to become a master of wisdom, he'll get there. Which means, when we analyze this person, we say, that is a potential Baal Chochmah. So the Rambam is saying there is a Baal Chochmah, and there is a potential Baal Chochmah. And in this potential Baal Chochmah, who cares about becoming a Baal Chochmah, whose aspiration is to be a Baal Chochmah, he already now is considered somebody who can't live without Torah. Now that explains how every single student has to have his Rav accompany him, even if he's not the best student. We have to assume that the average Rav is a decent Rav. And therefore, if this Rav chose to accept this person as a student, that means that the rabbi was able to see and to determine, or at least to detect, that this is a student with a healthy aspiration, who wishes to and is seeking to become a master of Torah wisdom. If not for that, this Rav would never have accepted him. And that's the reason why that you send the Rav with him into the Ir Miklat. You cannot leave the student with undeveloped potential. The Rav has seen the potential in him. He has that potential. Your guide to somebody's got to go with him to guide him and to help him and to ensure that he gets there. That he should actually become a master of Torah. How so? Firstly, you got to transform him from being a student who is not as he should be to a student who is an exemplary student, until eventually he becomes a master of Torah wisdom. That's a beautiful explanation. We can add even further. The fact that the Gemara said we have to provide for this student that which would be considered life for him. That's not just in the first opening few moments that he gets to his Ir Miklat. Okay, let's sort him out, make sure that he's got everything he needs. But we have to ensure that he lives as long as he is living in the Ir Miklat, till the Kohen Gadol passes away. And how do you do that? Well, if there's drinking water, there's drinking water. If there's a market, there's a market. But in terms of his spiritual development, That means we have to send his Rav with him, not just because right now he has potential, and please let's not let that potential go to waste. When all of this notion that Torah is his life is, at this point, still unrevealed, that one day he's going to become a great master of Torah. The fact is, right now he's somebody who's seeking Torah wisdom. We can be assured he'll get there. And he's probably started the journey. Therefore, we have to send his Rav with him, not only right now to ensure the potential doesn't go to waste, but because he's already a student who can't live without Torah. Therefore, he's got to have his rabbi with him. This gives us a very obvious lesson about how important it is to have a Rav, to have a mashpia. When a person does a personal self-assessment, a person might come to the conclusion, I'm not really an appropriate student, I'm not where I should be. And then a person could become despondent. I've tried for so many years, I'm not where I should be. I see my flaws. How do you escape that headspace and that situation to actually become an appropriate student? How am I ever going to become a master of Torah wisdom? It's not possible. And we get ourselves into a rut. So the Torah says, have a mashpia. When you find a true Rav, then an appropriate Rav will get you there. Will get you to realize that potential. Will get you to become a Talmid Hogan. Whatever your current circumstances are, as long as you have a yearning, a yearning to become a true student. Even if right now you're in a bad place, where your Rav has to kind of step out of his comfort zone to be able to come into your world. But Golus, like the Rav that has to go into Golus. The Torah says that's how it's got to be. When a student is in distress, the teacher has to go with him. So then not only will the teacher teach, but the student, the Rav, is going to invest to make sure that you become an appropriate student. Bal Chochma, a master of Torah. In fact, a true Rav will want you to become as developed as they are. So that's a beautiful lesson about the importance of having a mashpia. There's another spiritual lesson as well. The whole notion of the Rav going with the student into Golus has a spiritual application. Because every one of us, our relationship to the Eibishter is in a certain respect like the relationship of a student to a teacher. Like the pasuk says, all of your children, which means kol ben Yisrael, every yid, limudei talmidei havaya, are all students of Hashem. Which means every one of us is the Eibishter student. And if a person chas v'sholem goes against Hashem, doesn't have error. Well, until the person does tshuva, he's temporarily an inappropriate student. The only reason a person could do an avera is, I'm not a master of chokhmah. What does it mean, I'm not a master of chokhmah? To explain it, Rabbi Nazok Mavor Betanya Pasuk Hanal. So in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe addresses this pasuk, which is Chokhmah Techaya Ba'aleha, that Chokhmah gives life to its owner, to its master. He explains that means Shechayusa Shalish Yisrael Bo Me'akadosh Baruch Hu Seif Baruch Hu, that our love and our life comes from the Eibishter, who is completely infinite. And Torah describes that the plug-in for our life is Chokhmah Techaya. Chokhmah is the source of life. Because a big part of the thesis that the Alter Rebbe presents is how the touch point and the plug-in between Ein Sof, the Eibishter's infinite self, and our very finite self is the Chokhmah realm. Chokhmah allows access of the Eibishter into our lives. And through Chokhmah, that godly energy seeps into the rest of us. And the reason for Chokhmah is because Chokhmah is a state of absolute bittul, koyach ma. It's the ability to suspend ourselves in our preconceptions, and that allows the Eibishter. So therefore, when a Jew is a Baal Chokhmah, then he feels a connection to the Eibishter. The person detects and feels and senses that Ein Sof, part of the Eibishter, which is within the neshama. And if in that headspace, it's not feasible to do an Aveira. The only reason a person could do an Aveira is because they're not a Baal Chokhmah, meaning to say, you don't feel that connection to the Eibishter. You don't feel it. It's not real. It's abstract. It's theoretical. It's in the book. And so therefore, if a person does an Aveira, now he's got to deal with the Goyal Adam, which in the story of the Ir Miklat is a family member who wants to take revenge, and in the story of spiritual development, that refers to the Yetzer Hara who wants our blood, who's baying for our blood. Who's Satan, the Yetzer Hara, as the Gemara tells us, the Satan that entices, the Yetzer Hara that entices us, the Satan that accuses us, and the Malach HaMavis that carries out the punishment against us is all one entity. With a single goal, which is to spiritually kill a Jewish person. How do you save yourself? How do you create protection against being killed? There's a clear halach in Torah, that if a student has to go into Golus to protect himself against the intent of that Goyal Hadam, which is the Yetzer Hara, the Rav's got to go with. Which means in spiritual sense, even if we're talking about a Jewish person who is not living in a Baal Chokhmah state, should that imply that he's lost connection to the Eibishter? He doesn't feel connection to the Eibishter, but God forbid that he's lost connection. Because every single Jew, regardless, aspires to connect to the Eibishter. Like the famous saying of the Rabbi, Yehudi einu roitz v'enu yochel yis menutuk me'leikus. Ayid nita vil nita ken sein abgerissen von Eibishter. That a Jew cannot and never wants to disconnect from Hashem. Therefore, at any point, regardless of behavior, regardless of the external appearance, a Jewish person has this deep bond with the Eibishter. It's just that we don't see it. It's covered over with all the other nonsense. But says in Tanya, in a Russia, the love and connection to the Eibishter is fast asleep. But the fact is, it still protects a person from this Goyal Hadam, the Yetzer Hara is trying to suck the blood out of us, and protects us from spiritual death, God forbid. As soon as any of us illustrates and reveals our true aspiration to become a proper student, when you can clearly see that we care for and we're seeking a connection to the Eibishter and to learn his Torah. That has an immediate effect. It can immediately transform us to become an appropriate student and a Baal Chokhmah. And then we have the life force of that Chokhmah. Which means we then infuse the energy of Kedusha into every single facet of our neshama, which automatically cancels and neutralizes any kind of control that the Yetzer Hara would have over us. And that's on a personal level, but the same thing applies. It applies, and certainly in much greater ways, with regards to the whole Jewish people. When the Jewish people are in Golus, especially our Golus, especially in the extremely dark, difficult times of the days just before Mashiach, it's very easy to fall into despair and say, where will the answer come from? Where will the salvation come from? So Torah tells us clearly, in an halachic context, if a student is in Golus, his Rebbe is in Golus too. Because we know that the Eibishter instructs us to do things he already does. Only those things that the Eibishter honors does he tell us to do. There's no question that the Eibishter is with us in Golus. We're his student, he is the Rebbe, he's with us. As the Gemara tells us, wherever the Eden went in Golus, the Shechina accompanied them. And the Shechina is in Golus with the Eden, calling out to us to return. And I'll heal you on your return and through your return. The Eibishter is working on us to turn us into appropriate students, so that we can get out of Golus. Just like the Rav who goes with the student and has to get him into a good place. And yes, especially when you consider that the Gemara said that they have to exile the rabbi with him. It doesn't say they bring the Rav to him, but they exile the rabbi with him. Which implies that the Rav is in a state of Golus. It's not just that he relocates to this particular city and he lives freely in that city. If the Rav is with the student in the Ir Miklat, but he is living a free life, then he's not able to give the Talmud what he needs, chayusa, his life. Because they're living in completely different worlds. Because the student is effectively in house arrest, and the Rav is completely free. How do they talk? How do they relate? How does he mashpia on the student? How then could the Rav, if he is free and the student is imprisoned, how could he actually connect with him and have the desired effect, which is to turn him into a proper Talmud? Therefore, the Gemara says you exile the Rav with him. The Rav has to be in the same experience shared with the Talmud. And the same thing applies, so to speak, to the Eibishter and us. When we're in Golus, not only is the Shechina in that location, Shechina is with us, the Shechina is in a state of Golus. As the pasuk says, all of our distress is distress for the Eibishter. It's as if the Eibishter is sharing our pain. Obviously, because the Eibishter doesn't experience pain. Therefore, we should never despair. And regardless of how overwhelming Golus appears, we have to know that the Eibishter is protecting us, and the Eibishter is our shield, our shade, and the Eibishter is at our right hand. And especially when you consider that the Shechina experiences Golus, it's not just located in Golus. Therefore, even if you have some wild suggestion that we need to have Golus for a little bit longer, the pasuk says clearly the Eibishter is going to do it for himself. That the Eibishter will bring the Geula for his personal interest. And he'll do it hastily, without any delays, even the delay of a blink of an eye. The Eibishter is going to take us out of Golus, and he's going to bring us or lead us, and he's going to walk with us to the ultimate Geula, miad mamash, immediately.